Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chaya Molberg, and I'm the show vice president and general manager for Buildings NY. We're so pleased to have you here today on our Buildings NY Unlocked educational series. It's my extreme pleasure to introduce Kristen Harrington. Kristen is the product marketing strategist for SiteCompli and is going to be talking today about ways to improve inspections. So Kristen, thank you so much for participating, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Haya. And hello, everybody. My name is Kristen Harrington. As Haya said, I am a member of the team at SiteCompli. For those of you who joined us for last month's webinar about compliance, so happy to see you again. I have a special shout out actually to Marco from Urban American, who had some very nice things to say about our last webinar, but also knows I'm a big Disney fan and challenged me to share something from my collection since I'm working from home. So today I have Baby Yoda joining me on our webinar call. So he's going to help me answer some of your questions later, but for now we'll just set him aside. As I said, I am a member of the team at SiteCompli, and if you haven't heard of us, SiteCompli is the leading provider of property operations solutions here in New York City. So we help teams manage everything from local law compliance changes, which is something we talked about in last month's webinar, and their responses to those changes, to performing better on-site inspections and enforcing standard operating procedures across your portfolio. And during last month's webinar, we did talk a lot about a number of the city's regulations that have changed in light of COVID-19. In fact, I mentioned during the webinar that it's quite possible the minute we gave the webinar, things would be changed. And of course, that's what's happened. There have been some big adjustments, especially to, oath hearings and some other things. So if you have a minute, go to sitecompli.com/blog. We'll make sure it's up on a slide for you later so you can easily copy paste that. But make sure you're up to date on those latest changes so your team knows exactly what to do in light of COVID and the recent reopenings from different city agencies. But that said, even though dealing with city compliance changes is a huge part of what you have to deal with from day to day, we know it is far from the only thing that managers have to deal with. In fact, I was sitting here and I was, making a list of all the different things that owners and managers have to deal with, and just kind of, going on and on and on. And as you can see, like it was really never ending. It was very easy to come up with even these few things. And oh, look, I'm not even done yet. And in fact, I could continue to go on. I sat here thinking about all the things that your team does. And again, this slide doesn't even cover a single fraction of that. Oh, and of course, on top of that, now there is protecting tenants, residents, staff members, everyone in your organization from COVID on top of all of this. So there is what seems like a million things that need doing every day at every property across your portfolio. And that's in addition to all the work that you're doing that's focused on actually growing your business. And of course, if one thing falls through the cracks out of this entire list and more, it could increase your company's exposure to risk or limit that growth potential. So how do you not just manage all the things, but actually excel at all the things? Well, unfortunately, this list isn't getting any shorter. And while the ways your team is working right now might have been okay in the past, dealing with everything on top of all the changes we've seen in 2020 and possibly in the future is a different story. And so with that said, there's got to be a better way to manage the everyday tasks you're tackling for your organization and how they ladder up to your team's goals. So today we're here to find the best practices that your team can adapt, both large and small, to set you on a path for that better way. And I'm really lucky. As Haya said, I'm a product marketing strategist. A lot of time people say, well, what exactly does that mean? But actually a big part of my job is chatting with people like you every day, property operations professionals and experts, to learn what your day-to-day is like, what's working for your team, understand the challenges that you're facing and you're tackling, and how that changes from month to month and year to year. And throughout all those conversations, we've seen three key trends that have evolved from management teams that are successfully creating plans and executing on them. There are three keys to improving not just your on-site routines and inspections. It's more than that. It's the best practices impacting every aspect of how your team works. So ensuring that everything both on-site and back at the office is going according to plan and according to your high standards. And so there's a lot more to performing better routines and inspections than just the physical tools you use. It's reimagining how your team works, how you assign work, how you track work, how you manage those changes. These three keys: keeping communications consistent, creating standard operating procedures and enforcing them, and thinking like a tech company, which is the most interesting to me, and I'll tell you why, touch on ways to improve all of those things about how you work together. So I'm really excited to dive into each one and share how other teams are changing and adapting and what your company can do to adopt some of these best practices. So on some of the slides that we're going to share, I'll show some questions. Those questions are meant to inspire you as a leader at your company, at your organization, to think about how your team works and how you can make small changes that have a huge, huge impact. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is keeping communications consistent. And this practice seems very basic. That's true. That's exactly why it's so important, especially when you're dealing with constantly shifting priorities and new problems to handle. So you might know exactly when you want to perform monthly or weekly inspections, what kind of inspections they should be, but one tenant request can throw your whole schedule out of whack. So when teams are presented with so many things to do, some carefully planned and some surprises, as we know can happen quite frequently, how do you communicate consistently with your staff and ensure that everyone's always on the same page? All right, this slide is giving me a fair bit of agita, and I'll tell you why. And I think many of you can relate to it. We are so connected that if something goes wrong or if something needs doing immediately, it is easy to get in touch and assign work or relay news to a team member no matter where they are. But it is not easy to track that work, or in the case of phone calls or rifling through text or emails, even remember that conversation. And that can lead to a lot of things falling through the cracks. So, even in my company, for example, we have so many different ways to communicate. We use Microsoft Teams, we use Slack, email conversations, we have conversations over Zoom calls. It's a lot to keep track of. I love Post-its actually, because they are very fun and they are bright and colorful, and I like fun and bright and colorful things, but there are horrible ways to keep track of work. Typically, if I put a reminder on a Post-it, and I have so many Post-its lying around, it doesn't help me prioritize. It doesn't help me actually focus on the things that I need to do. So think about it. How do you communicate regular tasks versus last-minute emergencies to your team members in the field, right? And when that happens, when you communicate those things, does work fall through the cracks because something wasn't seen or wasn't seen in time, right? When you stop everything to focus on another thing, what routines are disrupted or even possibly abandoned because of those last minute messages? It's a really critical question. So how do your managers respond even to different types of communication, right? To calls versus emails, identifying where your team's issues are, saying, here are the types of communication in which we have issues or which have caused, greater issues or sort of butterfly effects, a lack of response to specific types of communication, or even the opposite, total distraction from calls and texts, is the very first step to figuring out how you can make your communications more streamlined, more effective, and less disruptive. Let's go into that a little deeper. So a good first step actually is to implement team SLAs. Now, you probably have SLAs for your tenants. SLAs, of course, is a service level agreement that gives guidelines about staff response times, availability, and sets expectations for everyone. It's not a bad idea, in addition to having those in place for your tenants or your residents, to actually put similar ones in place for your team, for the communications that you have internally. So I'll give you some specific examples. Some organizations say when we send an email, we expect a response within 24 hours. When we send a text, we expect a response within 3 hours. That's just an example of a very specific SLA, an internal agreement between people back at the office and people, on the ground, out in the field, and how they communicate with each other. And you should also be very specific about how you're communicating different types of things, right? So for example, you can create a rule that says all assigned work is always communicated through our work platform, not through text, right? So that way there's never any gaps, there's never any mixed messages, because people always know where to go to see what the next thing they have to do on their list. That way everyone knows where to reference specific projects, and assignments aren't buried and isolated and ultimately lost in someone's phone or even in their inbox. So the less time your team spends rooting through different messages on different devices or trying to remember what to do, the more time they can spend actually doing the work. It's one of the reasons why a lot of teams use task management systems or other centralized platforms to manage work and requests, so nothing is lost among all the other forms of communication that you're dealing with day in and day out. And we'll touch base on this a little later too, in another form, but I think it's something that's really important to remember. It's also critical that new information is collected uniformly, especially when that impacts your already planned work. So what's a really big example of new information? Tenant requests, right? That's huge. That's always new every time they come up, or other associated surprises. How is that information being collected at your organization? Are tenants just calling the on-site manager or super, and the super is responding in real time, right? That's a lack of oversight, because that means phone conversations can happen in a vacuum and they're not necessarily tracked, or there's no oversight to them. And if that happens, what kind of work could that possibly be throwing off? What type of risk could result from any inspections that are put off, or from any maintenance work that's delayed? Is there a better way for your team to process and prioritize all your tenant requests? And whether that's a centralized portal where tenants can log requests, or a call center, the more control you have over designating who is handling what request and when, the less likely that all your planned inspections and all your planned work that is critical and important will be thrown into chaos. So those are some really important points to keep in mind for keeping communications consistent. Again, we'll touch on this a little bit later when we discuss some other points, but really consistent things that a number of successful management teams have been implementing that help them get more oversight and, of course, have more consistency when they're communicating and assigning work with each other. Moving on to creating standard operating procedures and enforcing them, which is the really critical part of it. So standard operating procedures, a shortened form of SOPs, or also known as protocols, it's a term that's getting traction in a lot of different industries. So not just property operations and management, but so many industries, especially now that many people are working remotely and need more guidance, or executives need more oversight on exactly what's happening. And that's because it's so critical to ongoing operations for any business. And when it comes to property management, to the ongoing operations of your properties, but ultimately the consistency of your business and the likelihood of growth, the actual execution of those growth plans. So standard operating procedures are the best way to really bake into what you want to have happen at your buildings every time something is done. So for example, maybe it's your team's policy to always send a follow-up customer satisfaction survey after inspections where the tenant is present, right? That's just something that you want to have happen consistently as part of your process. And that survey has to be sent exactly 2 days after the inspection happened. You establish these protocols clearly, so it's just not important for your current team, but it's also critical for anyone that you bring on board, right? That process might not be standard at other organizations. And so it's really important that, when you expand your team, or when, there's turnover, there's someone new on staff, that they're able to ramp up quickly, but they're also able to, ramp up to your standards to make sure that they're consistently doing things like sending those follow-ups when they're supposed to, so, that your business plan, that your business really continues according to plan. The clearer your projects and your work requirements are, the faster new hires can ramp up and contribute to the work that you're doing, to the work that you want them to do for your business. Let's dive into a super specific example here. And because it's me and I can't help myself, we're gonna bring it back together to compliance. We're gonna dive into a really specific example on the residential side of property operations, but the basics are applicable for nearly any management scenario that you're facing. So let's talk Local Law 55. Now, as many as you know, Local Law 55 is a pretty recent annual requirement for residential owners and managers, where owners have to inspect every unit for signs of allergen hazards. So things like pests, rodents, and mold. And now the tricky thing when Local Law 55 was released is that there wasn't much guidance from HPD or even the Department of Health or Mental Hygiene about exactly how those inspections should look, right? It wasn't baked into the law. It wasn't necessarily baked into the rules about kind of what step-by-step procedures you should take for the inspection itself. And that actually hasn't even changed now, as again, managers are doing more and more inspections are happening after New York City's, initial reopening phases. There are lots of guidelines for performing remediation work and for preventing issues related to those allergen hazards, but there isn't a city mandated step-by-step process for performing the inspections themselves yet. That could always change, as we all know, but that's how it exists currently. So that really leaves it to you and to your team to determine your standard operating procedure for performing Local Law 55 inspections, which makes it all the more important to get it right. Failing to spot something and perform required work can result in HPD penalties or potentially even harm to tenants. And if you leave it up to each individual super to decide how to perform their own inspections, you might get wildly different practices, which from building to building, which actually leaves your team more open to risk, leaves an increased possibility of critical issues going unseen, depending where the inspection happened, when it happened, and who's performing it. So, standardize your process. It's a good idea to sit down with your team, whether that's environmental experts, your supers, a combination of the two, and determine what's the best course of action as soon as anybody steps foot in a single unit, in every unit, right? A good, repeatable process. Or, does your inspection process even start before that with pre-work? So, for example, let's break it down. As part of Local Law 55, there's actually a flyer type pamphlet that HPD produces that you need to provide to tenants, informing them of the annual inspection requirement and of course some other information about allergen hazards in general. So your team should notify tenants about the inspection because it's baked into the law itself. That is a known, that's something that we have to have as part of our protocol, it's part of our standard operating procedure, right? That's step one in the process. Otherwise, what do you want your super or inspector to do every time they arrive at a unit? Where should they look first? Most importantly, where should they always look? What can't they miss? What areas should they document? What types of details should they be looking for? And what type of pictures do you want them to capture? Really critical questions that you and your team can answer when you're building out that standard protocol, right? The more specific you are, again, the less likely something is to go unseen. The clearer you can be in those instructions, in those protocols, the better off your team will be when they're performing them in the field, the better off your business will be going forward. And if they do find evidence of allergen hazards, right, how does the remedial process actually kick off or begin? How is that work assigned? What steps can your inspector take to make sure the proper follow-ups are all in order and are ready to go for each unit as it's necessary? So outlining the exact steps you want everyone to take every time, including appropriate inspection tools and materials, is a really great place to start. In fact, we know that one of the clients we work with for performing, COVID checks, their COVID checklist, they actually outline within their checklist a list of acceptable materials and tools at the beginning of each checklist. So there's no question as to whether or not, how team members can protect themselves when they're performing these duties. And let's actually talk about that a little bit. Certainly, last but not least, when it comes to Local Law 55, you need to figure out how you'll swiftly and effectively implement changes to your protocol. And that's just not Local Law 55, that's for everything. But let's talk about it in the context of this example, right? Local Law 55 requirements have been in place. The law went into effect at the end of 2018, so they've been in place for certainly over a year now, but COVID precautions are going to impact how you want to run unit inspections across your portfolio, right? And the city hasn't released updated guidance yet on, performing these inspections in the time of COVID. They've released a lot of guidance on, construction safety sites and on general safety in buildings and occupied buildings, which is great, but not really specifically in the context of, inspections. So you're really taking best practices from lots of other things and building them into your inspection protocols. So again, it's up to you and to your team to determine how to keep your tenants and your residents safe, but also your staff safe when they're performing these inspections. So make sure you know that when you need to make changes, whether it's because of COVID or because of something else, because you want to adapt or tweak something in your procedure, make sure you know that every single person performing inspections is aware of changes in the process and are able to implement them as quickly as possible in the field. Are they wearing masks? Are they able to socially distance from the tenant when performing the inspection, right? These are questions that you would want to bake into your protocols and communicate that so people know. So again, it's not lost in the communication shuffle. These are really important things to consider when you're building out that particular process. And on that same note, I want to talk a little bit about how you actually enforce standard operating procedures, because that's very critical as well, right? Creating them is almost easy compared to making sure that they actually happen, right? You can write everything down in a manual and you can have people read it, but if they're not actually doing it on site, then the process is a little bit lost. So let's actually talk enforcement. A number of teams are using technology to log work performed on site and then assess and review what's happening back at the office. So for example, is there a specific step in your inspections or in your processes, in your routines that isn't happening, that just isn't happening frequently from unit to unit or building to building? There's got to be a reason for that, right? If there's a pattern, that's something that you can look into and identify. But the hard part is identifying that pattern. So if you can pinpoint any spot in your standard operating procedures where things are failing, you can find out why that's happening, work with your team members to actually assess the problem, make adjustments, and improve compliance with your protocols. But again, it's all about having that information. And one management team that we work with is actually using their data from their inspection app to host weekly reviews and to highlight what went well last week, what didn't, and what exactly needs to change. It's a really good opportunity for having everyone on their team get together, view actual data and numbers behind their work, and then quantify their team's performance, right? So not only are those reviews a chance for you to improve your inspection and your routine policies, it's also a great opportunity for everyone on your team, from supers, from property managers, to executives, to compliance leaders, to collaborate and to have their voice heard during the standard operations procedure process, right? To be a part of that creation process. It's a really great benefit to hosting those meetings, whether they're 5 minutes or 10 minutes or otherwise, because then team members are more likely to follow your policies when they're on site, because they felt a part of the creation process. They built their own insights on the ground, their own expertise that they've gathered from being in the field, and they can provide insights on what's really happening. And again, make it a really valuable experience for everyone. So having the ability to see what your team does on site, even when you're not there, and again, what they do compared to what you want them to do, especially when you're not there, is really table stakes for improving your company's processes and building standard operating procedures that your team will actually want to follow. So those are definitely some tips that we've gotten in the way of protocols and SOPs. And again, we'll be sharing some stories over on the SiteCompli blog as well, if you're interested in learning more about how other teams have managed that process. But some good tips on how you can not only create those processes, but understand how to enforce them. So now let's go into the final key, which of course is thinking like a tech company. And this one is really, really interesting to me because of course I work for a tech company, right? And it's funny because we get asked different things by our clients and our friends in property management all the time. Like, we've been asked, what software do you guys use for inter-team communication? How do you train your team members? What does your onboarding process look like? And we've always approached all of these questions and all of our challenges, frankly, by asking ourselves one really simple but very critical question. And here it is: how can we reduce friction for our team so that they can focus on doing the core part of their job? And I'm gonna let that sink in for a little bit. I'm gonna take a sip of water and let that sit, because I think it's really, really important. Also, for all of you tuning in, you'll notice last month, I had my Rugrats glass. Now we have our Beauty and the Beast glass. Always turn into a SiteCompli webinar because you never know what glass I'm gonna have. But anyway, now that we let that, sink in for a bit, and internalize, this really is kind of the lens in which a lot of us look at the challenges that we face, or at least, like how I try to look at different challenges that we face. Management teams everywhere are doing more with less. You're implementing more procedures, you're, having more requirements, both, within your own companies and of course externally from different agencies and local law bodies. You're performing more and more work and more inspections every day, every week, every month, and we know that there are only so many hours in a day, right? So what can you do as a leader at your organization, as someone looking for creative ways to improve how things are getting done across your buildings? This question is a really great place for you to start. To ask yourself, how can we make changes to reduce time spent on things that have to get done? We know they have to get done, but they don't move the needle. And we want to spend more time doing things, focused on things that directly impact our annual goals, our NOI, net operating income, whatever that North Star is for your team. And I love that term, having a North Star, because it really brings all the work that you're doing into focus, right? So the more creative solutions you can implement, whether it's technology or whether it's reworking your processes, the better off your company will be. And frankly, the better off you'll be in your individual career as well. So let's talk specifically about some of those creative solutions. And I want to start with automation. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret, and I will probably lose my marketer's license for this, but that's okay, because I think it's worth it. A lot of times when you get emails from me or from my team, from Kristen at SiteCompli, I feel like you might have guessed this anyway. You probably made this assumption, but it is the truth. We utilize marketing automation software. So I am not sending all of those emails directly to you. And that makes it much easier for us to share information with all of you. If I was manually sending emails, I don't think I would ever leave my desk. I don't think I would be giving this webinar right now. I would still be sending emails to you about the webinar. That's how long the process would be, especially if you're trying to communicate really critical information to a lot of people. But it wasn't always that way at my team. We didn't always have that solution. And so sending emails used to actually be a super painful process that took way more time than it needed to, until we asked ourselves the question, how can we automate this process? How can we make it easier so we can focus on delivering those last minute compliance changes, those critical local law city announcements to you as quickly as possible, without having to, manually handle the task of getting all that information out, getting all those emails to you. And that's why my team uses something called a marketing automation platform to help us share and spread information more quickly. And again, if there's a quick compliance change, it actually, only takes me a little bit to put that information together and send emails, make sure that information gets to not only you, but your colleagues and other thousands of people across the industry, which is so critical. That's amazing, right? Well, that's automation. And automation can be found not just in the marketing field, but in every single industry. And it's starting to appear in a lot of property operations technology too. So the questions here are to think about the time you're spending doing administrative work, right? Again, work that needs to happen, that is necessary, but doesn't necessarily move the needle or get you towards those higher level goals. Where are there points in the process for automation? Automation meaning things that can happen without you having to send that email, manually press that button, make that call. Are there technology solutions that can help you automatically connect the administrative dots so that your work gets done faster without you having to, directly manage it or more actively manage it? So what are some small things you can implement, whether it's changes in your policy or, again, technology solutions to ensure that your team spends way less time on busy work and more time on their actual work? And it's not a bad idea, again, to take these questions, to take the previous question, especially that, how can I automate this process? What necessary but painful administrative tasks are taking up too much of my time, too much of my team's time, and kind of just sit there and maybe write down some ideas about what's going on in your day-to-day that could be better if it was automated, that would get your company to their goals, to their endpoint, to that better NOI, that better return if things were automated, and then go ahead and build your solution from there. And I want to also talk about one last quick point, which I said, again, harkens back to what we discussed about keeping your communications consistent and streamlined. I mentioned earlier how our team sometimes struggles with the myriad of ways we can get in touch with each other and make requests, right? You know, there's a lot of information and a lot of places to share it, but the one thing that we do have on our team is a single point of truth. That's how we label it for any work we're assigned. So in our case, we actually use a product. We have a solution that assigns tasks to certain team members on our team and lets us track the progress to those different projects, right? So I can log on at any time and see, you know, if there's something that I'm depending on another team member for, exactly where they are in the process. So I know what I need to do. I know what I need to wait on, or what I need to help with. And that way, there's no confusion over requests that are missed. There's no need for me to send a message or an email or another call or schedule a meeting or, you know, take more time out of the things I'm doing just to answer those simple questions. I know if I need my colleague to do something, I have to assign it officially via this specific task process, because ultimately it'll benefit us both, and it won't get lost again in those emails, in those calls, in those various points of communication. So whether it's task management or whether it's noting that all work requests maybe have to be in some form of writing, keeping a single record for things that need to get done is so critical. And that way there's no confusion and there's less of a chance of something getting lost in the shuffle. And we also know emergencies or last minute requests happen. They happen all the time. They especially happen in property management, right? So sometimes it's necessary to send that text or make that call or communicate outside of the channels that you've designated. But taking the time to go back to your single point of truth and document what happened is the best way to maintain consistency in your records and make sure that your team's work is counted and documented, especially in case you ever need to go back and reference it. You know, for example, if there is an incident, right? If there's an on-site incident, documenting key information, especially, you know, if there's harm involved or if a tenant gets injured, is so important. Logging it in your team's single record of truth is so important for protecting not just your staff, but also your company from future harm or liability. So again, just one specific example of why having that single record of truth is so important, as opposed to, you know, weeding through different types of communications. And with that said, I knew today was going to be a little shorter, but that's because I think we have some really big questions for you to focus on and figure out, you know, again, how you can make small incremental changes to what you're doing in your day-to-day to make a huge impact on getting towards those results that your company wants. And so if you're interested in learning about how other property operations teams are using automation, or about how you can start saving time through implementing these best practices, again, head on over to the SiteCompli blog. That's sitecompli.com/blog. In addition to all the compliance news that you need for your organization, you'll also find some best practices, some stories from your fellow owners and managers about how they're implementing things like automation to make their day-to-day much better for their team to reach their goals much faster. So stay tuned to that blog, of course, for more news there. And that said, hi, I just want to check to see if we have any questions. Again, I know today we wanted to make things shorter, make it a half an hour or a quick bite, but I'm happy to answer some questions if we can.
If you have any questions, please go to the chat box and enter them, and we will read them to Kristen. I wanted to thank you so much and remind everybody, I forgot to say at the beginning, we are recording this and it will be available on demand. A lot of great info that Kristen's given that I'm sure you'd want to reference back. Talk about having a North Star. This presentation right here is it. It's really dynamite in a short period of time on how we can all better utilize our teams and our team function, especially now when things are so crazy, as well as understanding what we need to do when we go in for inspections. So all very helpful. So the webinar as well as that blog will be our North Star.
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
At this point, there are no other additional questions that you haven't already covered in the presentation. And I just want to thank you again, and you'll be able to view this on demand later. And we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for participating. Thank you,
Yes,
Chris.
have a wonderful Thursday, everyone. It was great to be here. And again, I hope you can take some of these questions and start thinking about how you can use them to improve the way your team works.
If
Have an
nothing
awesome
else, watch a Disney movie.
Yes, yes.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
We'll say goodbye.